Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Harry Sherrard, and on behalf of the Talks team, very warm welcome to our last talk of 2025. Excuse me. I saw Dilip Sarkar speak several years ago, and I've been after him for a couple of years. I've been nagging him for several years to try to get him to come to Brooklands, and I'm pleased that he's finally agreed to come and talk to us this evening. Now, he's described as one of the world's leading experts on the Battle of Britain. But when you know that he's written 65 books, and on behalf of the Battle of Britain Memorial Trust, he wrote an 8-volume, million-word account of the Battle of Britain. Is there actually anybody else in the world who knows more than him about the Battle of Britain? I think probably not. So what is fantastic, Dilip's with a long career, and his talk tonight is not so much a technical talk about the hurricane, but it's a talk about individuals that he has spoken to. There's probably nobody on the planet who's actually spoken to more actual Battle of Britain veterans directly than Dilip. So without any further from me, a big hand please for Dilip Sarkar.
Thank you, Harry, who has harassed me on Facebook for probably about 3 years, I think. Actually, it might be 4. And in my defence, Your Honour, I would say that the pandemic probably stalled this evening. But I'm delighted to be here. And thank you all for coming. What a fantastic crowd, especially with that horrible traffic. And it's freezing cold out there. You know, well done everybody for coming. So thank you, it's really great. And Brooklands, what a place. I can't really understand why, but I've never been here before. I'm ashamed to say. And it's just remarkable. I think that the whole museum, and Harry has shown me around this afternoon with Martin, my publisher from Pen and Sword, and founder of Britain at War magazine. Martin never ever shouts about himself, so I'll shout about him. He's my friend. Yeah, absolutely fantastic place. And I take my hat off before we start this to all of the volunteers. You know, I mean, none of these museums could function without volunteers. And I just think it's absolutely fantastic. The effort, the commitment in all weathers, all times of year, it's inspirational and humbling, actually. So I'm impressed. And then when Harry just told me that the museum has 7,000 members, I think that's more than the Labour Party. So, that in itself is remarkable. So I really do genuinely mean it. To be here at Brooklands, where 90 years ago the Hawker Hurricane first flew, it is overwhelming almost in itself. I'm one of those people that you can feel the history sort of coming up through the soles of your shoes sometimes. It's like walking on the middle gun deck of HMS Victory that was actually at Trafalgar, that middle gun deck. It's a similar kind of thing. So, you know, as Harry said, I'm not going to talk and dwell too much on the technical aspects of the hurricane. There are people in this room who are engineers and know far more about it than I ever will. My interest has always been in the human experience. But before we go down that road, you know, this is one of the very early hurricanes, a Mark I, built here and delivered to 56 Squadron at North Weald. And it's a snapshot, it's not a propaganda picture. I'm much more interested in the snapshots that were taken. Now, photography on service installations was strictly prohibited. So it's surprising how many clandestine photographs and snapshots were taken. And all of the pilots that I met, and as Harry says, there were many, I was able to copy their personal albums. Now, I didn't actually meet this pilot whose album this originated from, and this is he, Flight Lieutenant Steve Squeak Weaver, DFC, in his very early Mark I Hurricane up from North Weald. Now, This is another big part of my research. The stories of casualties, those who have lost their lives in the service of the country and who therefore now have no voice, has always been my big driver. That is why I did what I did. And Percy Weaver, sadly, was one of those, because he was shot down and killed in a big air battle over the Thames estuary on the 31st of August 1940, and the following day, 56 Squadron were relieved and pulled out of 11 Group, London and the South East, sent to Boscombe Down in Wiltshire. If he could have survived that day, who knows? Maybe I would have met him. But I did meet his nephew, Paul, who's been a friend of mine for years, and that's the man himself in his white flying suit, pre-war white flying suit, and Paul with his uncle's Distinguished Flying Cross. And of course, this is just such a great thing, that people are so proud of their ancestors who did these remarkable things. And we heard on that excellent film about Arthur Robert, about the fact that these were ordinary people, ordinary men from ordinary backgrounds. But were they? Not to me. They were supermen, because they did extraordinary things. And I think that the loss of people like Squeak Weaver, who was one of the people who was a real part of the backbone of 56 Squadron, is a loss that not only Fighter Command at the time, but humanity just cannot afford. Now, this is another snapshot. This is another early Mark I Hurricane at the time of the Battle of France. So this is a 32 Squadron machine. It's actually the mount of Flight Lieutenant Peter Brothers, who's pictured in the middle there when he was a flight commander on 32 Squadron. That photograph, very famous photograph, taken by Fox at Hawkinge, our closest airfield to the Germans, just 22 miles across the Channel at Calais. And it's a terrific photograph. It is an official photograph, but it really captures the spirit of the time. And more recently, at the Kent Battle of Britain Museum, located, strangely enough, at Hawkinge, that scene has been replicated in bronze in the memorial known as the Spirit of the Few. And I love that. I think it's absolutely superb. And one of the pilots in that photograph was Pilot Officer Keith Gilman, who on the 31st of August 1940 became rather the pin-up boy of Fighter Command. And some of us here may well have on our bookshelves the Battle of Britain Then and Now encyclopedic volume, and his face adorns the cover of that rather landmark book too. Sadly, Keith Gilman, who was a local lad from Dover, in fact, was already dead by the time that issue hit the news agents. Gilman was killed on the 25th of August 1940 when he was reported missing over the Channel. And in his casualty file, we now have access to many casualty files in the public domain. There is a heartbreaking letter in there from his father to the Air Ministry, dated 1947, who had heard that there was a British serviceman who had appeared in a hospital in France with memory loss. And Mr. Gilman was absolutely desperate to know whether there was any remotest chance that that could be his son. And sadly it wasn't. The individual concerned had never served in the Royal Air Force. But this is the thing about these people who are missing. And Weaver was missing as well, shot down over the Thames estuary, crashed into the foreshore and the River Blackwater, and there's no doubt he and his Hurricane are still there. This is probably one of my favourite Battle of Britain Hurricane shots, 605 Squadron at Croydon, aircrafts of Cooper Slipper. And again, there's so much information in that. That is not a post shot. It's actually at the height of the Battle of Britain. You can even see that the ground crew, who are rapidly rearming and refueling that aircraft, are wearing tin hats, battle bowlers. So that's a real genuine Battle of Britain scene. And also at Croydon was this chap, Peter Townsend. Now, this is going to be interesting because, I'll tell you why. Earlier on, now, my erstwhile friend here, he gets ever so embarrassed, you know, who is substantially younger than me, we were talking about the content of the show tonight, and I said about Peter Townsend. And I said, the trouble with Peter, who I knew very well, lovely man, is that when people think about Peter Townsend, they think about the Princess Margaret romance scandal. And Martin knew nothing about him. Now, fortunately, we're all of an age in this room. I dare say many of us here can remember it. Now, actually, I can't, because it was just before I was born, actually. But we know what I'm talking about, don't we? Right. But there was so much more to Peter Townsend. And I first met Peter about 40 years ago. And at that time, he just auctioned his medals for about 100,000, which was a lot of money 40 years ago. And he used all of that money to set up a trust fund for child victims of war. And indeed, after he left the Air Force, he became a freelance journalist and he covered the Golan Heights War in the 70s. And that was the first time he'd actually seen a dead body. And it moved him deeply. And he was a very sensitive man. He was a real gentleman. But flying a Hurricane with 43 Squadron, he shot down the first German aircraft to crash in England during the Second World War, a Heinkel 111. And Peter, being the kind of man he was, it's no surprise to me that Peter visited the gunner, Carl Missy, who had lost an arm in the engagement when he was a prisoner and in hospital, and kept in touch with him and tried to make his lot a little bit better than it otherwise would be. But that's typical Peter Townsend. And this is Peter leading 85 Squadron. He was promoted to lead 85 Squadron out of Croydon. He survived being shot down in the Battle of Britain, became an ace. And those of us of an age may well remember the 1970s Airfix 124th scale Hurricane. That was a great kit, and still is. And one of the options to build the kit was Peter Townsend's Hurricane, which I built. And I kept my instruction booklet. I don't know why, I just liked it. I thought it was a really good piece of instruction book. And years later, I got Peter to sign it. And that occupies quite a special place in my archive. Now, after the Battle of Britain, the Germans had been defeated. The German daylight bombing offensive had been defeated. It had been defeated by the 30th of September 1940. And the Germans then switched almost exclusively to bombing at night, the problem being that our nocturnal defences were in their infancy. We'd still yet to get dedicated night fighters, like the Beaufighter was only just turning up, and the Mosquito, and so on. So Hurricanes were pressed into the nocturnal defence role, and 85 Squadron became a dedicated night fighting squadron. And Peter's there with the squadron mascot, the Alsatian. And on the left of the photograph is none other than John Hemingway, who became the last of the few, or at least the last of the few that we know. Now, when we talk about the few, what are we talking about? We're talking about fighter command aircrew who flew at least one operational sortie with one of the 72 or other accredited squadrons or other units between the 10th of July and the 31st of October 1940. And that qualified the individual for the Battle of Britain Bar, more of which later. And John Hemingway left us this year, aged 105, the last of the few that we know of. So this year, this 85th anniversary of the Battle of Britain, has been a landmark year because it's the first year we've not had any of the few alive to share it with us. But again, down at the Kent Battle of Britain Museum, Paddy Hemingway is immortalised in bronze. So that's a great tribute to the last of the few. And another Hurricane personality, James Brindley Nicholson, who became the only RAF fighter pilot of the Second World War to be awarded the Victoria Cross. Now, why is that? It's because fighter combat moves so fast, it's rarely witnessed, but in this case, the events were witnessed by just about everybody in Southampton. And on that day, 249 Squadron had recently moved to Boscombe Down, and Boscombe Down was an important station because from there the squadron could participate in the defence of Southampton and Portsmouth and the aircraft factories in the West Country. And on the 16th of August 1940, there were really determined German attacks on airfields on quite a broad front. And Nicholson is leading his section, Red Section, comprising Squadron Leader Eric King, who was attached to the squadron as supernumerary, and Pilot Officer Martin King, no relation. And it was Martin King's first sortie. And they're on patrol over Southampton with the squadron and sight a formation of Junkers 88 bombers in the distance. Nicholson gets permission to detach and chase them, but 152 Squadron Spitfires beat into it. So Nicholson then just broadens the scope of his patrol, and in so doing gets bounced and shot down. All 3 Hurricanes were shot down. Nicholson climbs back, is on fire, he's abandoning the aircraft, and according to his account, he sees a Messerschmitt 110 in front of his gun sight, which he believes is the aircraft that shot him down, climbs back into the flames and attacks the 110 and eventually bails out, which was really only the start of his problems, because when he was close to the ground during his parachute descent, he was shot at by a home guard with a 12-bore. And when the ambulance arrived to take Nick away, a butcher's boy, in fact, turned up on a push bike and beat up the home guard sergeant, and the ambulance took the home guard sergeant away first. It's honestly true. Now, the thing is, we know now that Nicholson's section wasn't shot down by Messerschmitt 110s, which is a twin-engine German fighter with 4 very heavy 20mm cannon in the nose. They were actually bounced, which is to say ambushed, by Messerschmitt 109s, single-engine German fighter. So there's always been controversy about Nicholson's account. Now, we know that there were no Me 110s shot down that day. So Nicholson, if he did hit a 110, he certainly didn't bring it down. And it has really been the subject of debate and controversy. But when I was doing, as Harry said, this 1 million word, 8-volume official history of the Battle of Britain for the Battle of Britain Memorial Trust, I managed to get copies of 1,000 Luftwaffe intelligence documents from an archive in the United States. And these were the full operational manifests for a lot of the day-to-day attacks on this country. And on the 16th of August, it clearly says that 11 Me 110s of the 5th Staffel, which is a squadron, of Lehrgeschwader 1, which is a training unit, actually took part in that attack. So Nicholson may well have seen a 110. I really can't believe that he'd make it up. Nicholson, sadly, didn't survive the war. He didn't feel that he'd earned the Victoria Cross, so he tried even harder and won a DFC, went off to the Middle East flying Beaufighters, and was eventually reported missing over the Bay of Bengal as a passenger in a Liberator bomber right at the end of the war, when he really didn't even need to be there. The other thing that's interesting about that particular action is Pilot Officer Martin King, who's buried in Fawley in Hampshire. He, we now know, was the youngest of the few. He was 18 years old. He wasn't the only 18-year-old. It's always been believed that Geoffrey Wellham, Spitfire pilot with 92 Squadron at Biggin Hill, was the youngest, but actually Martin King was younger than Jeff. So he was 18 years old. And in Fawley Cemetery, he isn't actually the youngest in there, because also buried in there is aircraftman Ray Wheeler, a Southampton lad, who was a radio operator on an air-sea rescue launch that was dive-bombed by Stukas in the Channel in August 1940, and he remained at his post, transmitting distress calls, even though he was suffering horribly from seasick, and eventually was strafed and killed. So it's a sad old place, Fawley. If you're ever down there, it's a very interesting cemetery, actually. There's quite a lot of people in there who could talk all night about. In fact, I used to have a T-shirt that said, "I'm a historian, I'd be more interested in you if you were dead." Yeah. Anyway, not far from Fawley is North Baddesley, in which churchyard you will find the highest ranking RAF officer to be killed in the Battle of Britain, Wing Commander Johnny Dewar, a very early DSO and DFC, who commanded 87 Squadron in the Battle of France and the early part of the Battle of Britain, flying from Exeter. And over the West Country there, at that time, there was horrendous fighting over Portland, over the Channel, over Weymouth Bay, over the Solent, over the Isle of Wight. And on September the 11th, he was actually station commander of Exeter then, having relinquished command of 87 to Widge Gleeve, who we'll talk about shortly, and made an unofficial flight from Exeter to Thorney Island, where his wife was a cipher clerk. But on the way, he ran into a big German raid on Supermarine on the flight sheds at Eastleigh. So he obviously engaged and then went missing. Exeter didn't release details of his loss until the day later. So for many, many years, until only a couple of years ago, his headstone actually gave his date of death as the 12th of September. But I proved to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission that it was actually the 11th that he was lost and the headstone's been changed. But he's the highest ranking RAF officer killed in the Battle of Britain, and a Hurricane pilot. Now this is Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, who ended the war as Air Chief Marshal Sir Keith Park, a New Zealander, a legend, a warrior in every sense of the word, who had been an artillery officer with New Zealand forces, the Anzacs, at Gallipoli in the First World War, then, as you do, became a fighter ace, and in the Battle of Britain commanded 11 Group, London and the South East, with his headquarters at Uxbridge, which is close to Northolt. And from Northolt, we always knew that he flew around his command in a Hawker Hurricane, OK-1. Trevor Howard, in the 1969 Battle of Britain film, portrayed him perfectly, I think, in his white flying suit, in his Hurricane. So Keith Park's always been a very big interest of mine. And the surprising thing was that a couple of years ago, my wife Sue and I, and in fact Sue will be listening live stream, so hello Sue, she said I wouldn't do that, but I have. Hello Sue! Hi Sue. We were in Auckland, New Zealand, and we visited the Auckland War Memorial Museum. And unbeknown to me, in there were Keith Park's medals and other memorabilia. But I was surprised to see on his 1939-45 star the Battle of Britain clasp, which is only for aircrew who flew operationally. Now, so far as we knew, Park's flights around his command were not operational. Nobody could tell me why he got that bar, although I don't think anybody was ever going to tell him to take it off. But nobody could tell me why. Not the family, not the museum, not the Royal New Zealand Air Force Museum, nobody. But we did find in the Royal New Zealand Air Force Museum's archive Keith Park's Battle of Britain logbook. And astonishingly, in there were 2 operational flights. Now, Keith Park is an Air Vice Marshal. He's a group commander. Incredible. And on the 10th of July, which is the official start date of the Battle of Britain, he flew around several stations and then over a convoy. And at that time, that's where the fighting was. It was over convoys in the Channel. So he was looking for trouble. And 2 days later, he flew to escort the Prime Minister from Kenley to Northolt. So they're operational flights. So I was on a mission then to make sure that we got Keith Park recognised as one of the few himself. Not just a leader of the few, but one of the few. It may surprise you to know there is no actual official list of the few. The closest thing is the de facto list from medal cards and the award cards. And lo and behold, Keith Park's card was missing. Probably hence the confusion all these years. But we proved that he had flown operationally, so it was accepted by the Air Historical Branch that he was indeed one of the few. And his name was added to the Battle of Britain Christopher Foxley Norris Memorial Wall at our National Memorial to the Few on the cliffs above Folkestone. And I was very proud of that. Now, 2 things I'd say. One, that looks like an extremely narcissistic photograph, for which I apologise unreservedly. But at the time, I was very busy dealing with Keith Park's family, who we got over from New Zealand in September of the 85th. And also, I do have different clothes. I've just noticed I am wearing the same clothes. So I can absolutely assure you that is merely an oversight. So Keith Park, a Hurricane pilot, the only high commander who could fly one of the RAF's new modern fighters. How about that? Now, also at Northolt was No. 1 Squadron that had been heavily engaged in the Battle of France. And in the centre there, wearing the forage cap and the life jacket, is Pat Hancock, who for many years was Honorary Secretary of the exalted Battle of Britain Fighter Association, membership of which was exclusive to the few themselves. And he was a great supporter of mine and put me in touch with lots and lots of pilots, and very, very grateful for Pat's help. And he was a Battle of France veteran. And of course, after the Battle of France, during the early part of the Battle of Britain, the squadron is receiving replacement pilots, including the tall pilot to Pat's left, who is John Francis Durham Elkington, more commonly known as Tim. No idea why. And according to Tim, when he walked into dispersal at Northolt, Pat Hancock, who was a serious veteran, said, "Oh my God, they're sending us schoolboys now." And that's what Tim felt like. And I quote, unquote, "I was just pilot officer idiot. I didn't know what was going on." Well, he wouldn't. He was only about 19. Incredible. And on the 16th of August, again that day, that heavy day when Bryn Nicholson undertook his signal act of valour for his Victoria Cross, 1 Squadron are scrambled down to assist in all of that fracas that's going on over the south coast, Southampton, Portsmouth, the Solent. And Tim is shot down by Helmut Wick, who was the leading German ace at the time. Now, Tim bailed out wounded, but during his descent he passed out. And on the way down, Fred Berry, who's on the right there in that photograph at the double wedding there, Fred Berry used the prop wash of his Hurricane to blow Tim towards land because he was drifting out to sea. And Tim eventually landed unconscious but safely on the beach at East Wittering. Sadly, he never got the chance to thank Fred Berry because Fred Berry was killed the following week and Tim was still in hospital. But after the Battle of Britain, Tim went off to Russia. Now, I've seen your Hurricane here today, which is, again, a real monument to volunteer efforts, really. I mean, it's just magnificent, isn't it? A Hurricane from Russia, Operation Benedict, going to provide the Russians some air support around Murmansk an archangel, and teaching the Russians how to fly Hurricanes. So Tim was over there and a part of that. And then the merchant ship fighter unit. Now, what a suicide trip that was. So you've got this black spot in the Atlantic where there's no air cover. It's beyond the range of air cover, even beyond the range of the Sunderland, the big 4-engine long-range flying boat. And of course, it's at that point that the Focke-Wulf Condor, the German maritime reconnaissance aircraft, is managing to operate and guide the wolf packs, the U-boats, to attack the convoys. So the idea is that the Hurricane is fitted with rockets, and there are ramps put on the merchant ships, catapult-assisted merchant ships, and the Hurricanes are launched off these ramps. Now, there is a significant problem with this. They cannot land. And if you imagine having to take off, intercept a German aircraft, and then bail out into a freezing cold sea and hope that you get picked up, well, good luck with that. And I always think of Pilot Officer John Kendall, who flew Spitfires during the Battle of Britain with 66 Squadron, who flew with the merchant ship fighter unit, and he intercepted a Condor. He actually did a rocket-assisted launch, and his last radio transmission before he bailed out was to report the position of the German crew in their dinghy. And the German crew were picked up, but they never found John Kendall. So he is still missing. Fortunately, Tim never had to do a rocket-assisted launch. But this is Tim airborne in his MSFU Hurricane at a Speak when they were training before they went to sea. And that was Tim, who stayed in the Air Force post-war, did all kinds of things, did many, many hours in the Avro Shackleton, was a witness to the atom bomb testing after the war, and settled quite happily at Little Rissington in the Cotswolds, not far away from me. And we knew each other very well. And Tim used to drive his family insane because he was so modest. When I wrote the final few in, I think, 10 years ago, each chapter of which was about one of the very few survivors of the few at that time, I included Tim's combat reports, which are a matter of public record at the National Archive. Oh, he didn't like that at all. You know, oh, this is like shooting a line, you know, you can't put this in, did it? You know, well, I did anyway. But the last time I saw Tim wasn't long before he passed on, and that was in 2018. And my son James and I went and had Sunday lunch with him. And I was talking about the fact that I like staying at Bell 2 Lighthouse at Beachy Head, which is a bit of a unique bed and breakfast experience. And of course now we get all these two-seater Spitfires and things down there all the time. And Tim just had this faraway look, and he said, yeah, Beachy Head. You know, he said, I remember during the Battle of Britain, he said, it was a really hot day, and we'd been on patrol, and we were going back to Northolt, and we came in over Beachy Head low, and with the Hurricane canopies slid back open. And he said, down below, the farm labourers, they were burning stubble in the fields, and you could smell this wood smoke. And he said, I looked down and I smelt this smell of this wood smoke, and I saw those people, and I just thought, that's England, that is. And that's worth fighting for. And oh my God, it got me right there. What a quote. Why didn't I have that for the book? You know, I've used it since. But I mean, oh, I couldn't believe it. And I'm a big Facebooker. Find me on Facebook. And I put on Facebook, oh, you know, bit rare, lunch with Tim Hampton. Oh, this is what he said, you know. And his daughter Tess ran me up and said, oh, Dad's going mad because you put that on Facebook, you know, that he's just so modest. But what a lovely man. A privilege to know these people. This is Tom Gleeve, very good-looking chap before the war, professional Air Force officer, Cranwell, etc. And Tom was getting on a bit, really, by the time of the Battle of Britain. He was about 25. and he was desperate to get command of a fighter squadron. He was a squadron leader, but he was at Bentley Priory. He was being used as a liaison officer between fighter and bomber command, and he'd also been a controller, desperate to get back into the cockpit. He'd previously flown Hawker Furies and Hearts with one squadron down at Tangmere, and he manages to get posted to 253 Squadron. There's a bit of a peculiar setup, really, because the squadron was up at Drem in Scotland, and Tom was supernumerary there to gain experience. And he is usurped in a way. He really wanted command of the squadron, but it was given to squadron leader Starr, Eric Starr. So they worked out between them that they would sort of command the squadron together in shifts. And then 253 is sent south to Northolt. Now, it's very important to understand that up in the north of England, that's way beyond the range of German fighters, way beyond the range of the single-engined Messerschmitt 109, which was an excellent aeroplane, heavily armed, 220mm cannon, superb aeroplane. So up there, what our squadrons are doing is really chasing around lone German reconnaissance bombers, that sort of thing. There was the big attack, of course, on the 15th of August 1940, the greatest day of all in the Battle of Britain, when the Germans attacked from Sunderland right round to St. Evell in Cornwall, I mean, on a huge broad front. But that aside, and there were no Me-109s there, and the Me-109 made such a difference. Now, when Hitler made this unprecedented advance to the Channel coast, which then put London within the range of the Messerschmitt 109, that changed everything. It changed the complete strategic air picture, because prior to that, it was perceived that any air attack on this country would come across the North Sea from bases in Germany and would then intrude over the east coast. But that would have been beyond the range of the Me-109. So before the war, it was even perceived that there would be no fighter-to-fighter combat. And it was actually thought that because of the speeds that the new fighters could reach and their manoeuvrability, that the forces this would impose on the human body meant that fighter-to-fighter combat would actually be impossible, which proved not to be the case. And what happened, if you look at Battle of Britain casualties day by day, you'll see that you'll suddenly have a new squadron number with lots and lots of casualties, maybe up to half a dozen pilots lost in a day. And that is because the transition between the north of England and coming down to the combat zone in the south was, in the words of Peter Brown, who flew Spitfires with 41 and 611 Squadron, traumatic. And the tempo of combat was totally different. So 253 go to Northolt and literally get hacked to pieces on the first day. Lost lots of pilots. The following day, the CO, Starr, is shot down in the morning, killed. So Tom Gleeve takes over. That afternoon, Tom, who actually claimed 5 Me-109s destroyed that day, and made him an ace in a day. Whether actually they all crashed is another matter, but nonetheless. Tom is shot down, very, very badly burnt, bailed out, and he was helped by a family from a local farm who put him to bed while they waited for an ambulance, or he actually was taken to hospital in the back of a car in the end. Very uncomfortable journey for him. But his greatest concern was the mess that he was making through bleeding onto the farmer's wife's sheets. But he survived. And to give you an idea of the heat, that's a piece of his Hurricane that was recovered from the crash site in Kent that's now in the possession of Tom's very proud daughter. who also has his silver cigarette case that was on his person at the time, very badly dented and knocked about. And fortunately his logbook, which is an incredible source of information for people like me. And this is Tom after quite a few operations. Now his book, I Had a Row with a German, is a very important one. The title wasn't his choice. He wanted it to be called Nemesis of Eagles. But the publisher, and publishers have an eye for this kind of thing, decided on I Had a Row with a German. And that came from when his wife visited him in hospital, and you can imagine he's covered in, swathed in bandages from head to foot. And she said, well, what have you been up to, dear? And he said, well, I had a row with a German. So that was where the title came from. But it was an important book because it was published in 1941 under a pseudonym, RAF Casualty. All of the proceeds went to the RAF Benevolent Fund, and that was the first Battle of Britain memoir, first-hand account, to be published. The following year, 1942, there were lots of them. There was Brian Lane's Spitfire, David Crook's Spitfire Pilot, and Widge Glee's A Rise to Conquer. But that was actually the first, a Hurricane pilot. Now, Tom's burns were so bad that he was treated in the burns unit of the Royal Victoria Hospital at East Grinstead by the pioneering reconstructive surgeon, Sir Archibald Mackinder, who's on the right there. And some of these chaps, they got together and decided that they were going to form the Guinea Pig Club because they were guinea pigs for Mackinder's pioneering surgery. So these are the founder members of the Guinea Pig Club. And Tom is there on the extreme left, holding the wheelchair of Geoffrey Page, who was 19 when he was shot down and his fuel tank blew up in his face in his hurricane. And Geoffrey Page survived and actually really was the leading light that led to the creation of our National Memorial to the Few at Capel-le-Fern. But in Tom's book, one of the people he talks about, because all the names are redacted by the censor, is Poley Boy. And Poley Boy was this very, very tough character, Krasnodebski, a Pole, who had been shot down and horrendously burnt, flying with 303 Squadron, again from Northolt. And the Poles were the largest foreign national group to supply pilots during the Battle of Britain. And their contribution was immense, without a doubt. Their flight commanders were Royal Air Force pilots, and their commander was English, Ronald Kellett, who's on the wing there of his Hurricane. And to Kellett goes another Hurricane first. He landed what is without doubt the most battle-damaged aircraft of all in the Battle of Britain at Biggin Hill, and it was literally, I am reliably told, held together with a couple of bolts and a bit of bracing wire. So it was really, really just incredible that he did that. So that was the Poles, and a lot of the other Poles were embedded in RAF squadrons. And this is Anton Glavacki, who flew with 501 Squadron. Now, 501 Squadron, County of Gloucester, an auxiliary Air Force unit, was the only one of Fighter Command squadrons to actually serve in the front line for the whole 16 weeks of the Battle of Britain, and consequently suffered the greatest number of casualties, 16 pilots. And that picture, again, another authentic snap, that's taken at Gravesend, and behind you can see there's one of the squadron's Hurricanes, and beyond that there's a 66 Squadron Spitfire. On the left is Tony Pickering, who survived, who I knew very well. And in the middle, in the tunic, Paul Farnes, another long survivor, not that long departed from us. And Glavakis to Paul Farnes' left. So another very authentic photo. And I think it's fitting that at Duxford, we've now got one of their Hurricanes completely rebuilt and flying again, with the codes SDX, which was Ken Mackenzie's aircraft, which the slide at the start of the hurricane over the sea, Ken Mackenzie used his wingtip to knock an ME 109 into the channel, damaged his wingtip. It was called Mackenzie's knock. Now, this character was a particular friend of mine, Sergeant Peter Fox, 56 Squadron, one of the replacements after 56 was withdrawn from North Weald to Boscombe Down, went there with his friend Dennis Nichols, Nick Nichols, and Peter was shot down on his first engagement, 30th of September 1940. Kampfgeschwader 55's Heinkel 111s came to attack the Westland Aircraft Factory at Yeovil. They'd had a lot of success. They virtually flattened Filton at Bristol. They had destroyed, to all intents and purposes, Supermarine at Southampton, and they were now coming for Westlands. Owing to a navigation error due to cloud, they missed Westlands but actually bombed the lovely biscuit-coloured town of Sherborne that has no military significance whatsoever, and virtually destroyed the town centre, which was very sad, caused a lot of civilian casualties. But Peter is shot down that day. In his hurricane, he comes off worse with an ME 110 with that 20mm cannon arrangement, bails out over Lyme Regis. And when we talked about this, Peter was very specific about where the hurricane crashed. And he said, I remember coming down on parachute and I could see the hurricane and it crashed literally on these sort of cross hedges of this field boundary. So I said, well, let's go and dig it up then. So we did. And Peter was able to meet eyewitnesses who watched him come down, and we all had a great day. Now, to recover these aircraft, you need a licence issued by the Ministry of Defence. And when you've done your recovery, you're obliged to submit a returns form. So you detail what you've recovered. Then the Ministry of Defence transfer right of ownership from the Crown to the licence holder. So in this case, when I applied for the licence, I did it in Peter's name as a member of our group. And when we submitted the returns form, I did that in Peter's name. So right of ownership was transferred from the Crown to Peter Fox, which makes him the only Battle of Britain pilot to ever own his own Battle of Britain fighter, even though it was in probably 2 million pieces. But it's a fact. And I was very pleased to present Peter with that frame presentation back in '96 that's now in the proud possession of Peter's daughter. Now, this is a very famous photograph that I'm sure many people will have seen. It's been published many times over the years, and it's Flight Lieutenant Ian Widge Gleeve. The Widge was because he was very short, and it was short for Wizard Midget, because his favourite saying was, "Oh, wizard." So Widge Gleeve there, leading his flight up from Bybury in Gloucestershire over the West Country. Now, Bybury is quite... but you probably wouldn't think that Bybury would be a place where there would be fighter squadrons, but there was. A flight of 87 Squadron was there in the Battle of Britain, and it's an important location because you can whip across the Bristol Channel and provide some defence to Swansea and Cardiff, and you can also provide defence to Bristol and the other aircraft factories around the West Country, Westlands, Parnell at Yate, and so on. So it was quite an important little place. And these photographs that I'm going to show you were taken by Pilot Officer Watson or Sergeant Lawrence Thorogood. And they are snapshots. This is the real deal. This is not reach for the sky stuff. This is the real thing. And this is Gleede himself in his Hurricane at Bybury. And again, those of us of an age who remember that Airfix Hurricane, the other option for the kit was this one, ALK, Widge Gleede's Hurricane with Figaro the cat on the side. And in fact, all of 87 Squadron's aircraft had Disney characters on the side. So this is Lawrence Thorogood, the man himself, with his Hurricane, with Goofy on the side. And Lawrence's nickname was Rubber, because when he landed, he bounced. And that's Rubber on his Hurricane at Bybury. And the remarkable thing about these snapshots, again, these are absolutely authentic. Now, a lot of scale modelers get bent out of shape about aircraft models that are allegedly over-weathered. Well, they need to have a look at that, because that Hurricane looks like it's just fought the Battle of Kursk or something on the ground, you know? So this is really authentic stuff. Now, years ago, of course, it was fantastic having the few available to talk to. And when I was doing the big history, you know, it was so frustrating sometimes. It wasn't so much the questions I asked them as later on the questions I wish I'd asked them. And that if they'd still been around, I could have just picked up the phone. But it's still possible, if you try really, really, really hard, to turn up new unseen material, such as this. This is a remarkable collection that came our way about 3 years ago. This is Pilot Officer Alexander Osmond of 213 Squadron, Hurricanes, at Exeter and Tangmere. And his son, Tony, had all of this stuff, including 2 logbooks, and his photo albums, and the most absolutely amazing thing was this collection of letters. 400 letters exchanged between Alexander and his wife. Now I've got thousands of letters that Battle of Britain pilots wrote me, and I do mean thousands. But what I haven't got are my letters to them. So this is usually common. You genuinely only get one side of the story. But in this case, there's both sides of the story. But trying to decipher them is a different thing altogether, unfortunately. But it's quite a collection. So there is still original material out there. It's still worth looking. Now, sadly, Alexander Osmond, he was very young, and he flew again in those vicious combats over Portland and Weymouth and over the Channel. 18th of August, what my old mentor, Dr. Alfred Price, dubbed the hardest day. He was shot up by a 109 and got glass splinters in his eyes. It's all detailed in his logbook. But then after the Battle of Britain, he was sent to the Far East, where, sadly, very shortly after he'd arrived, again flying Hurricanes, he was shot down and killed by the Japanese on the big air raid on Chittagong. So he's buried out there. Chittagong's now in Bangladesh. But again, we come back to this thing about how proud people are, and rightly so. And this is Tony, who never knew his father. Tony was a year old when his father was killed in the Far East, but proudly holding there the wings that were taken off his father's tunic, and a Hurricane, which is one of the very original frog models, flies right off ground, that his father made for him during the Battle of Britain at Exeter. Now, I think that is just such a poignant, moving, physical thing, that Hurricane. And just to sort of conclude, I don't really want to dwell too much talking about the other one, the Spitfire, but I will talk about something that Gordon Mitchell, the son of R.J. Mitchell, the designer, who was a friend of mine, said to me. He said that his father was always very conscious that his Spitfire was basically a machine. It was metal, and it was inanimate object until a human being climbed inside it and flew it. And he was very conscious that that human being was going to have to fly his machine into great danger, into battle. And he was very concerned about that. And I'm pretty sure that Sidney Cam, designer of the Hurricane, must have felt the same. And let's not forget what these men did, because the fact of the matter is, without the Battle of Britain, there wouldn't have been any other battles. If Britain had fallen in 1940, that would have been the end of it. There were 544 Fighter Command aircrew lost their lives in the Battle of Britain. 168 of those were Hurricane pilots. Similar number of Spitfire pilots, and the rest were Defiant aircrew pilots, air gunners, and a few Blenheim aircrew. So the Hurricane really was a very important airplane in 1940, being available to the Royal Air Force in greater numbers than the Spitfire. This is all stuff that is widely known. And I have so much respect for the Hurricane and for the people who flew it during that early part of the war when Britain was alone. And Britain's back was against the wall, wasn't it, literally? So, thank goodness for the Hurricane. Now, as Harry said at the start, I've written a few books about this. And I don't know if I should say this, but I probably can. I was very pleased that the final volume of the official history, Battle of Britain Remembered, it was all about really how the battle's been commemorated and memorialised over time, and a guide to museums, memorials, sites of interest, and so on. And we were honoured that the foreword was written by Princess Anne, who, of course, is president of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. So I've been dedicated to this all my life, and I can't see any chance of that ever ending. I think I felt some years ago, as the pilots, who were great friends, were dropping off their perch, if you like, and I was attending too many funerals and having to speak at too many funerals, that they were so kind to me, because I started doing what I do when I wasn't very old, a teenager, and they gave me unreservedly of their time, their kindness, their friendship, and that I had a moral obligation to keep telling their stories. And that's why I'm here tonight. And I'm very pleased, and I thank you for allowing me to spend an hour talking about my favourite subject. I absolutely love it. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much, Dilip. That was absolutely fantastic. So you can see now why I spent 4 years trying to get him here. So Chris has got the other mic there. Anybody got any questions? Not necessarily limited to the Hurricane, but the subject generally. Got a chap just down here.
Thank you. Yes, some very interesting stories. The Spitfire is obviously always seen as the glamorous plane, etc. But I always feel the Hurricane gets underrated in a way, or it just doesn't get the same attention. Do you think that's unfair, or?
No, I don't, and I'll tell you why. I'm just about to become the most unpopular person in the room. So what's happened is the Spitfire is a winner as soon as it's come off the drawing board, because of the Schneider Trophy, which became a matter of huge national pride between nations who competed for this incredible trophy, and races over the sea, and Mitchell's team won with the S6B and S6, and that design eventually became the Spitfire. So at the time, we heard on the film earlier about Stanley Baldwin telling the House that the bomber will always get through. Well, that's because the air doctrine at the time was exactly that the bomber was going to deliver a knockout blow so that the land general would have no need to fight a battle. So it was all about the bomber. So spending on the fighter force was next to nothing. And in fact, Trenchard even said that fighters were only of any value to our own people to keep up our own morale. That was it, So, I don't remember where I was going with that now. So the Hurricane is available in numbers. but the Spitfire is the winner because people are terrified of air power. I grew up in the age when people were, nuclear power was the thing, wasn't it, in the Cold War? And there were lots of terrifying films and sort of public announcements and things like that, you know. And it was just like that, if not worse. And there were demonstrations of it in the Spanish Civil War. Guernica, you know, when the Second World War started, Warsaw, Rotterdam, people were terrified of it. And the Spitfire was seen as the sword that was going to save us. It was a propagandist dream in a way that the Hurricane wasn't. So that was one part of it. But the other part of it is actually nothing to do with propaganda. It's to do with the aircraft themselves. And the Spitfire was the only one that could take on the 109s at high altitude. And it was really interesting writing the series because it's day by day, it's every single squadron action, every single raid, that the 109s and fighter combat is all about heightened surprise. It's all about ambush. So he who has height controls everything. And the 109s are coming in increasingly higher until by the October 1940, they're coming in over 30,000 feet, up to about 33,000 feet in an unpressurized cockpit. Can you imagine? And it was only the Spitfire that could get up there and take them on, you see. So, of course, Keith Park used the Spitfire squadrons in pairs, flying from Hornchurch and Biggin Hill. He also used the Hurricane squadrons in pairs. So all of this nonsense about big wings, I've avoided that tonight because I could come back and talk about that another time maybe. But, you know, Park got it right. So the Spitfire was up there providing that high altitude umbrella. And if we hadn't have had that, the 109s would always have had the advantage. So there was an American friend of mine, John Alcorn, who spent about probably 2,500 years of his life and should have got out more, looking at, you know, really, 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 you know, as we all have now, looking at RAF combat claims offset against actual German losses and a wreck on the ground, for example, or something that you can prove has gone into the sea. And what John discovered was pretty remarkable, that the Hurricane and Spitfire force had actually shot down roughly the same amount of aircraft, which, because there were only 1/3 the amount of Spitfires, actually made the Spitfire more successful per capita. But you see, the reason that we all say, oh, you know, the Hurricane destroyed more aircraft than all of the other defences put together is because there were more Hurricanes and therefore the pilots submitted more combat claims. But there's a gulf of difference between a claim and an actual wreck on the ground. And there could be 5 or 6 of us shooting at exactly the same German aircraft, completely oblivious of each other. So that aircraft gets multiplied 6 times on the balance sheet. And the person who started this and who started talking about Spitfire snobbery, that the Germans always said they were shot down by Spitfires, was my old friend Peter Townsend. Now, there was a very famous academic historian called Sir Geoffrey Elton who said, and I always remember this, before you study the history, study the historian. What was Peter Townsend? He was a Hurricane squadron commander. Okay? So he may well have been slightly biased. So the problem, well, it's not a problem. Today, we have got so much more information. We are not driven by propaganda anymore. We are driven by the facts. I used to be a police detective, so my work has always been about evidence. That's all I'm interested in. It's not about having a preconceived theory that you then make the evidence fit that theory or anything like that. I am guided by the evidence. So whatever I say to you, I can back up with the facts, the figures, everything. And that's the case. So, but, you know, at the end of the day, if the whole of Fighter Command had been equipped with Spitfires, it wasn't a problem. If the whole of Fighter Command had been equipped with Hurricanes, that was a problem because of that high altitude performance. So, but we had the Hurricane, we had the Spitfire, and they worked hand in glove, didn't they?
A lovely talk, thank you very much.
Thank you.
My father, Bill, flew Hurricanes in Burma on 135 Squadron.
Oh, yeah.
Under Frank Chota Carey.
Oh, yeah.
And
yeah.
interestingly, he always said that Chota Carey never flew level. He always jinxed, even on the ground when he was taxiing. But as you know, Chota Carey won a DFM and 2 DFCs at the beginning of 1940. And of course, was a Battle of Britain pilot. Did you actually get to interview him?
I didn't, actually. He's one of the few I didn't. And he died quite early, didn't he? And when? Yeah. Was it 2002? Yeah, no, I didn't. I wrote to him. Yeah, I wrote to him, but I didn't actually go and meet him. I mean, a lot of the time, when I was doing my research and writing, 1, I wasn't very old. 2, I was skint. 3, I had a young family. 4, I was a very busy young policeman. And trying to travel all around the country, seeing all these people, it was very difficult. That's why a lot of it was done through correspondence and over the phone. But, having said that, I did meet a lot of them. But the reason that I didn't just go and interview people for the sake of it. If Frank Carey had crossed my radar with something that I was researching, I would have probably gone and interviewed him. But he never did. So the people I interviewed were people who were part of what I was doing. They were either about a squadron I was researching, a particular pilot, or a day's fighting, or something like that. So it was always quite specific, not just, I'm going to interview everybody who fought in the Battle of Britain, which now I wish I had done, but hey-ho, too late now.
Wonderful speech, a wonderful evening. What gave you the interest at, you were age 20, 30?
Oh, much younger than that.
Did you live near airfield? Or did
No. Okay, so I'm just going to put my tape recorder on now because I'm asked this question so often. And I knew I'd be asked it. So I think for me, what I would say is growing up in the 1960s, the Second World War was still omnipresent. That your relatives had been in it, your neighbours had been in it, your teachers, and people still talked about it. And in my experience, they talked about it a lot. Our neighbours on the one side, Mr. and Mrs. Anthony, were lovely people. John Anthony had been in the Royal Navy, First and Second World War, and talked about the war a lot. And his mother-in-law lived with them, who was a Victorian, old Gran, as I used to call her, and they'd lived in Portsmouth during the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, and they were bombed out. I was fascinated by this. But on the other side of the coin, my maternal grandfather was a grenadier who was badly wounded at Dunkirk, and his pal won a Victoria Cross. Got another book coming out about that, actually. Just get that in there. So he never talked about it. He was a prisoner of war for 5 years. He'd been at the sharp end of a bayonet. And I know what happened to him now. He never spoke to me, never mentioned Harry Nichols VC. We only found out about that on the day of his funeral in 1983. But growing up, I sensed that I really bought into this war stuff. I got the Victor, the Valiant, Commando, Warlord, the Orbis history of the Second World War. We were bombarded, weren't we, relentlessly by the Dam Busters, Reach for the Sky, Angels 1-5, Sink the Bismarck, everything. Air fixed models, Action Man, Johnny 7. I had the lot. Now, perhaps strangely for my father, who was Indian, he was a Quaker. And one day, we'd been to London and we stopped at Morton in the Marsh. And he said, I've got something to show you. I think at the time, I was about 10 at the time, and I just read Reach for the Sky. And I was on and on and on about Reach for the Sky, And in there, there's a Commonwealth war grave plot with probably about 100 aircrew graves in it, which I know now are from the Wellington Bomber Training Unit across the road. And he said, and I'll never forget it, this is what war is all about. Do you understand? This is what it's about. It's not a game, it's not a glorious thing. This is what it's about. And what struck me, walking along those headstones, is that they were real people. It wasn't Richard Todd pretending to be Guy Gibson in The Dam Busters, or Kenneth Moore pretending to be Douglas Bader in Reach for the Sky. These were real people, real pilots, navigators, air gunners. And what really resonated with me was a lot of them were Australian, Canadian, New Zealanders. And I thought, these boys, they're a long way from home. I wonder whether their families ever came to see these graves. Probably not. In those days, the world was a huge place, wasn't it? Not like today. Hop on a plane and go anywhere you like. You know, and it just really resonated with me. And I wanted to know what they looked like. I wanted to know what their stories were. I wanted to know what happened to them. So it started, you know, when I was about 10. And when I probably started research when I was about 16, I think, when I left school. And when I was about 18, I was absolutely, utterly irresponsible. And I just was so moved when I learnt that there were pilots in the Battle of Britain. And it was always the Battle of Britain for me. It was always my big thing, always. That they were 18. And I remember talking to several of my pilot friends in years hence who said that they were flying Hurricanes or Spitfires in the Battle of Britain, aged 18 or 19. And in fact, the youngest pilot, just after the Battle of Britain, ever to be killed flying with the Royal Air Force, was Geoffrey Painting, a Spitfire pilot who was only 17, can you believe? But they said that they couldn't drive a car, but they could fly a Spitfire and a Hurricane. And I remember Bob Morton saying that when he was taxiing his Spitfire along at Tangmere, he'd imagine he was driving a car. You know, and then we found some of the privately owned graves overgrown, and that really upset me. I thought, well, that's not right. And, you know, it's because families become extinct, they move away. This isn't the Commonwealth War Graves Commission plots, you know, these are private graves. And that's really how it all started. That, and I started researching the stories of casualties, and by doing that, that brought me into contact with survivors. And what I was interested in, now it's ironic really, because I wrote what was an official biography of Douglas Bader, warts and all, the only warts and all ever won, not your romantic rubbish. And I wrote Johnny Johnson, our top scoring fighter pilot in the Second World War. It was like a granddad to me. But I wasn't really that interested in them because the Stanford Tucks, the Johnsons, the Barders, they'd all had books written about them or had written their own books. What I was interested in was the Tim Elkingtons, the Peter Foxes, the Dennis Nicholls, who had got a shoebox with a logbook and their medals and bits and pieces in it, hidden away, up in the attic, forgotten about. After the war, they've got other priorities, haven't they? They've got new careers to embark upon. They've got families to look after. You know, the war was put aside. And I think it was all about timing, because I came on the scene when they were about the same age I am now. So they just retired. And for the first time, they got time to sit down and think about the war and start talking about it to somebody who wanted to listen. And I wanted to listen. And I could also say to them, oh yeah, well this is what happened to him. Oh well, I can put you in touch with him. You know, and it sort of just, it was a massive snowball. And I decided that these people, your Peter Foxes, and Peter always described himself as an also-ran, it was the also-rans and their experiences that really interested me. And I decided many, many years ago that I was going to record their stories and give them a platform to share those stories, whether they liked it or not. You know, and here we are tonight, you know. So
two tangential points. One is the Defiant was a very sad part of the Battle of Britain. The other point was I gather there was more Bomber Command casualties in the Battle of Britain than there was Fighter Command. And the real question I would ask you, what do you think is the significant contribution that Douglas Bader made to the Battle of Britain?
Okay, read my book. That's the first thing. in the big 8-volume work, I included Bomber Command's operations and Coastal Command operations. And I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because to me, I think it was wrong that Fighter Command was singled out alone for the Battle of Britain class. Because Coastal Command, if you know, day by day, all the operations, have looked at everything. Coastal Command, they were flying patrols of the North Sea, they were protecting convoys, they were doing important reconnaissance, they were attacking the invasion ports, Ostend, Boulogne, Calais, Dunkirk, and so on. You know, really essential work. And similarly, Bomber Command had a very difficult job because Bomber Command had got a twofold responsibility. Firstly, Bomber Command has got to do reconnaissance. Bomber Command has got to do attacking the invasion ports where the Germans are assembling their invasion barges. They've got to sow mines in the North Sea and the Atlantic to try and hem the German ships in. And then they've got to attack German airfields by day in the Pas-de-Calais. That's an untold story for sure. And they've also, in the Wellington bomber and the Hampton, they have got to take the war to Germany by night. Astonishing. When Churchill spoke on the 20th of August about so much being owed by so many to so few, he was actually talking about the Royal Air Force as a whole. So let's not forget that, and I'm really glad you made that up. I was asked specifically to talk about hurricanes. If I could have come and talked about other things, I would have broadened it out a bit, because I think that is so important that we remember that.
Another round of applause, please, for Dilip. Thank you very much.
Thank you.